So many people want to believe in a distorted version of karma, right? That good people will have good things happen to them and they ultimately win, and bad people ultimately lose. Listen, I was raised Hindu and I'm telling you that's not how karma works, okay? Let's talk a little bit more about this lack of justice that characterizes all narcissistic relationships. If you have experienced a narcissistic relationship, no matter what, this has been something that's on your mind. If there is one thing that really takes a toll on survivors, it's the toll that the lack of justice raised by narcissistic relationships takes on the survivors of these relationships. Narcissistic relationships are patently unfair, mostly because a narcissist doesn't play by any rules or rules that they've made up. The narcissist often just gets to waltz off into the sunset, and other people are left sifting through the messes that the narcissistic people leave in their wakes and that they don't care about. So, what does this do to survivors? And why is this injustice piece so hard? Most of us, whether through school, religious teachings, storybooks, or what we were told by our families, we were told to believe that life is generally fair, hard work matters, happy endings happen, all that just world stuff. And those often drive our core beliefs. So when we experience the cognitive dissonance of a narcissistic relationship and we believe life is fair and the narcissistic relationship is deeply unfair, we feel tension and we feel uncomfortable. The tension of cognitive dissonance is usually managed by justification. But if the relationship really goes south, you get played, you get taken advantage of, abandoned, you get left, financially harmed in a divorce, or just buffeted by the custody system, or harmed by a workplace issue or in a family matter, the justification stops working and we feel a sense of helplessness. We need justice and it doesn't come. We want revenge and there's no way to get it. Generally, there is often no real way to get revenge that is legal. Keep that in mind and won't end you up in jail or facing a lawsuit or place other people in harm's way. Dr. Romney does not like revenge. So I am here to tell you that in most narcissistic relationships, people don't ever get vengeance at the time that they want it. And knowing, for me even tell you that it's going to come in time, however it looks, it's absolutely no solace who need their tension to be reduced right now because of how unjust this relationship is, right? So, well, when that revenge can't happen, that tension has to go somewhere. And in a small, mercifully small percentage of cases, that revenge gets externalized, right? And that's where we might see violence or other criminal behavior perpetrated by somebody wronged in narcissistic abuse situations. Again, tiny percentage of cases. Or the person experiencing the narcissistic abuse harms themselves or ends their lives. Again, none of that, thank goodness, is the norm. But it's always a risk we have to remain aware of, especially those of us working with clients in this situation. So typically, that unresolved need for revenge, right, to offset the lack of justice. Do you know what happens with that? That revenge you don't get, it turns into self-blame. You say, what else could I have done? I'm so stupid. I didn't see it clearly. I can't believe I am this foolish. If I'd only tried this, done that, been different, been enough, said this, whatever. If I were more competent, this would not have happened. And as I have said in past recent videos on vindictiveness, the survivor even often feels guilty about thinking heavy-duty, revengey thoughts, but does acknowledge and maybe even smiles at the thought of something bad happening to the narcissist. That's fine, that's normal. I've done the same. That's the sequence, folks. And yes, survivors can actually feel a little lightened by thinking about revenge. But the challenge is that if it becomes obsessive, a person gets stuck in a thought loop where they can't let it go, and you're pretty much effectively stuck in the relationship. So what do you do? This is a tough one because in the absence of justice, Lots of folks get stuck there for a minute. Time is your friend. Slowly but surely, these thoughts do clear, especially if you do not have to have ongoing contact with the narcissistic person. This is why this justice issue is particularly difficult for people who are in co-parenting situations and ongoing contact is mandated. If you have to have contact with the narcissist, the justice piece always almost feels like a piece of food that's stuck in your teeth that you can't quite just get out. But just saying that time will help doesn't feel good when you are in the middle of it. Radical acceptance, thinking about it differently, it's important, but I know, because it ain't justice. And here, when you can't get that justice, is where your existential game has to be on. Because ultimately, there's only one thing in the long term that will work, and that is acceptance. Be angry, go ahead and entertain those vindictive thoughts, hope for revenge. Those are all fine. They're normal thoughts. Let them have their turn to go through your mind. None of us are above that. But after that happens, just as it would in any process of grief, that acceptance takes us to uncomfortable but necessary places to experience the shift in belief and recognize that life is only sometimes fair, that you can extract meaning and purpose from suffering. Some people turn to karma, hoping that there might be some kind of payback for the narcissist. Sometimes there is, but not as often as you would like, or by the time it happens, you no longer care. And this can be cumulative. If you are experiencing narcissistic abuse and narcissistic injustice, and also other injustices, BS at work, maybe you get screwed by a mechanic or a contractor, just day-to-day stuff, and then societal issues like racism or other societal injustices, all of that will add up. And that cumulative sense of injustice can just feel cavernous and you get lost in it. I got to tell you, I suck because I don't have an answer to this. I really do spend my days and nights trying to figure out how to help survivors manage this feeling of injustice. It's very real. It's universal. People who come out the other side sometimes will say, you don't ever fully let it go, and it can color a lot of your perceptions in life, but you do move forward. And one day, you do get to the point of indifference. And after that, at some point, you may hear that it did go to hell for the narcissist, and you really won't care. You may give a sort of rueful post-karmic chuckle, but beyond that, you kind of just shrug and keep going. Between that moment and now is one hell of an uphill journey. Use the time well and heal in spite of yourself. And if I can say, again, I keep encouraging you, I'm talking more and more about healing because I know that's what a lot of survivors want. If you want to do a much deeper dive on healing, go to the video notes, hit that link, and you'll learn more about the relatively new healing program I have underway to help folks who are trying to heal from narcissistic abuse. Today we're going to take on the proverb of what goes around comes around. Like I said, some of my greatest pleasure is to sort of poke around, find the proverbs, but even more so, it's been hearing from many of you, especially even sharing proverbs from around the world in your native language and then translating them to English, that I'm now able to apply to narcissism. So there's a lot of great folk wisdom that could translate into what we know about narcissism. Now, this particular proverb, what goes around comes around, I actually wasn't able to find a clear sourcing on this one. Lots of people were that were citing that it might have said it came from different books, magazine articles, even different songs. There are equivalents of this proverb in different languages. For example, in the Russian, it translates to, as the call, so is the echo. But whatever the source, it even seems to have a bit of a karmic flair, but not really, because karma isn't actually about what goes around comes around. It's a bit more subtle than that. However, this proverb actually has lots of has lots of applicability to understanding narcissism and narcissistic relationships. First, this proverb, what goes around comes around, it actually fuels a strange hope. A hope that someone who has done so much harm to you or to other people will finally get theirs. On average, this can be true, but it's definitely not as true as we would like. So let's break that down. The biggest fear that many people have about narcissistic people, especially when it is a romantic or intimate relationship, is that the narcissist will go on to the next person, be better for them, and that the next person will have the proverbial happily ever after that you had hoped you were going to get. And we really hope that that doesn't happen, but we're afraid it will. We look at the narcissistic person who has been lying and cheating and generally being a one-person psychological wrecking crew, and we genuinely hope what goes around comes around. We hope that someday that this narcissistic person will get called out, maybe in a very public way, or perhaps their next partner will be the one who cheats on them or does a number on them. To think like this fits our sense of justice and makes the math sort of work out. So there is a kind of a probability thing here. Remember that narcissism, like any personality trait, and especially rigid and antagonistic traits, is stable and pervasive, meaning that it generalizes across people and situations. The more comfortable they get with someone, and frankly, the more someone also activates the narcissistic person's shame, the more badly that they will behave with that person. So over time, narcissistic people always tend to blow things up, just as they are doing or that they did with you. The goes around comes around can be captured so that in many cases, though definitely not in most, the good people step away and have had it with the narcissist, leaving the narcissistic person abandoned over and over again. They may end up getting labeled difficult to work with, or may fool people long enough to get into relationships with them, but inevitably it will blow up because they will do the same things to each subsequent person they're with. The more dysregulated narcissistic people tend to be the ones who keep blowing stuff up. Over time, especially as they get older or have fewer resources or perhaps have less power, it will be more difficult for them to attract people to them, which is why, as narcissistic people get older, they are more likely to get into relationships that tend to be quite transactional. There is a point where they do have to straight up make the relationship financially useful or financially expedient for the other person to actually keep them around, because otherwise nobody really wants to spend time with them anymore. But a lot of this really does come down to the enabler quotient around them. The more enablers that the narcissistic person has around them, the less going around and coming around we see. Even when all of the sane and healthy people step away from the narcissistic person, the enablers are there, propping up the narcissist, feeding their victimization, and giving them enough supply to keep them going. This can happen in family systems where everyone protects the toxic person until the end of their lives. So in those cases, what goes around does not come around. The healthy people leave, the enablers stay, and the narcissist may be protected from what many people actually do think of them. It also can, as often it does in these narcissistic relationships, it often comes down to money and power. When we see the high-profile cases of monstrous malignant types like Weinstein and Epstein, part of the reason we were so satisfied was that in that case, what goes around did come around. However, just stop and think about how many lives they damaged before the come around happened. For their victims, the coming around may have come around eventually or just too late. But malignant people like this are inflicting harm on other people for years and decades before getting caught out, and many, many more like them never get caught. Money and power often shield narcissistic people from harm, and people around the narcissistic, especially the powerful narcissistic person, are like those parasitic sucker fishes that hang around the shark and hope to get their leftovers. People hang around these toxic folks to get the leftover stuff of their money, access, power, or fame. So unless the narcissistic person really goes a bridge too far, like in these infamous cases, but keep in mind, even in these infamous cases, it took decades for them to come down. They did terrible things to people for decades. What goes around doesn't always come around because the abusers can keep behaving in an abusive manner and get away with it. If the narcissistic person does have a loss of power or access, we do sometimes get to see things starting to come around, a fall for grace, and maybe they don't end up in jail, but they may have to downsize their lives significantly. And then all of those parasitic fish that swim around them, they're not so interested anymore, and at best they may be left with a few kind of lingering enablers. Because our world is so enabler heavy, in a significant proportion of cases of narcissistic people, what goes around doesn't come around. It opens a much larger philosophical question. When you think about the world they live in, the world they live in is one of chronic victimhood, anger at the world, frustration, tantrums, always feeling slighted. It's actually a pretty crappy way to live. So maybe that's the coming around. To live in a world where you may put on a grandiose and entitled facade, but always feel as though you are under attack. Always feel as though people are out to get you. Always feel as though life is unfair. Always live in a sense of shame. It's a tough way to live. I often feel that the come around part for the narcissist is simply that they just have to keep being them and live in their angry world and in their angry worldview. There is so much damned beauty in the world if we can just push the toxic people out of the way. In a strange way, my heart aches for those who cannot see the simple beauties that are around us, and that would be the folks whose egocentricity always blocks out the sun. If you are in or you are leaving a relationship with a narcissistic person, don't wait or put your life on hold waiting for the coming around, the going around of it all. It may not look the way you think. It may come around for the narcissist, but it may take so long that you no longer care. And ultimately, the ultimate come around, like I said, is that they're stuck being them. Ultimately, in the goes around, comes around world, if you are fortunate enough to get out or to go no contact, then it came around for you. The data are clear that those who can eliminate the difficult people from their lives, they do really well. It's not possible for everyone, but boundaries, disengagement, firewalling, and just not getting into it with them, that's everything coming around. What's the difference between closure and justice in a narcissistic relationship? If you want to weigh in, drop it in the comments, but think on that for a minute. And just want to remind anyone who is interested in the deeper dive of healing and wants to join our narcissistic abuse healing program, this is a great month to do it because you get 25% off the first month. The code and more information are in the video notes, so check it out. Would love to have you join us where we go in deeper on all the things we talk about on YouTube. So it's a bit of a riddle. What's the difference between closure and justice in a narcissistic relationship? What are your thoughts on this? Kind of a trick question, as they all are. Well, I can tell you is you're not likely to get either one in a narcissistic relationship. That much is similar between closure and justice. Now, in narcissistic relationships, people desperately want closure. I often think that justice gets subsumed under closure, but they're actually not the same thing. I do believe that justice is a higher standard. Closure is something that can happen even if there's not whatever we consider to be justice. So how do we get closure? Accountability, the other person who's done something wrong in a relationship or something that hurts us, taking responsibility, understanding a person's motivations, getting a meaningful apology. Closure doesn't necessarily allay a broken heart or make you okay with what happened, but there is a wholeness we sometimes can feel, at least closer to wholeness with closure, a sort of closing the circle, as it were. And it can help people let go and move forward into healing. So you may wonder, and I've talked about this before, but to revisit it, why is closure so rare in narcissistic relationships? Because as a rule, people who are narcissistic are not accountable. They don't take responsibility. They tend to shift blame, and they don't give sincere apologies. The shame and entitlement that are part of narcissism and the subsequent defensiveness block narcissistic people from ever meaningfully copping to bad behavior, so they don't. That leaves the other person in the relationship walking around in a bit of a haze, alternating between blaming themselves, being angry, being confused, but never quite understanding what happened. Like I said, we may not always like the answers or the information we hear that help us with closure, but at least we hear something that makes sense to us, at least allows us, again, to close the circle and release it. Now, justice, that's an entirely different animal. And again, it's what we're taking on in my healing program this month. That's why you got to join it. Justice means that something was made right. Closure is just getting the information you need or the acknowledgement you need to move forward. Justice is about consequence, about trying to set things right. And I can tell you this, justice rarely, if ever, happens in a narcissistic relationship. Sure, you hear the stories here and there of a narcissistic business person losing everything or going to jail, or the narcissistic person who cheated on you moving into a relationship with the person they cheated on you with and looking loved up on social media, only to be rejected by the new person. That sort of feels just. Sometimes they are bigger ticket justices. We see a story in the news of someone who harassed or abused or behaved like a jerk to many, many people over many, many years and may have broken the law, and they actually get a meaningful penalty for what they did instead of a slap on the wrist. Now, justice is not always a guarantee of closure, but for most folks it helps a lot, and closure is definitely not a guarantee of justice. It's possible you get a meaningful apology, but the narcissistic person faces no other consequences and just gets to go back out in the world and do more harm. Well, that certainly doesn't feel just. But your part of it may feel closed. See, that's a difference between closure and justice. Our laws, our policies, our rules, our systems, and the people who run the systems, most of them by and large don't understand narcissism. So there is no recognition that this person is likely to do bad things again. There are no laws against being a jerk or an arrogant ass, and even if they were, they wouldn't be enforceable. So there's no systemic penalties against this. In the majority of narcissistic relationships, people get neither closure nor justice, and that can leave survivors sort of hanging in this sort of purgatory and not being able to heal, still grappling with self-blame, shame, anger, confusion, a whole torrent of negative and confusing emotions. People wonder how family court didn't get it, criminal court didn't get it, human resources didn't get it, their families didn't get it, their churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples didn't get it. Everyone's still talking enabling nonsense about two sides and all the rest of it. Nobody gets it, no closure, no justice. So, can you heal if there's neither closure nor justice? Yes, you can. You better be able to, because most of us don't get it. It's about radical acceptance, education about these issues, recognizing that systems, people, and family don't get it, but you can still know that this is a thing. All of that can help a little. Grief without closure is much harder, as a rule. Watching someone do something cruel and not face any kind of consequence can leave us with a sense of lack. If you can get closure, that's actually better than what most people are getting in these relationships. And sadly, sometimes the closure doesn't happen until years later, when the grief is over, when you have moved on yourself in many ways. When the closure takes that long, sometimes it brings up even more grief, wishing it could have happened earlier and set you free earlier. Sometimes when the closure happens, you're sort of indifferent to it. And it's the same with justice. The justice may not come as a result of what happened to you actually receiving a consequence, but maybe with the next person the narcissistic person goes at, maybe the justice takes a form you didn't expect. And you may even grapple with having positive feelings about their misfortune. For example, the narcissistic person ends up wasting all of their money and living alone in sort of less than optimal circumstances or having nowhere to live. At best, you may take the stance of, you reap what you sow. But for survivors, most of whom are deeply empathic, experiencing that as justice doesn't always feel good. Maybe for a minute as karmic payback, but knowing someone is suffering or not doing well, or may even be in a dangerous situation, is not likely to be a solace to a person who once cared about the person who is struggling. Perhaps living without closure and justice is about faith, still believing in yourself and in love and in life, despite not getting a sign or something to make it all okay. Living without closure and justice certainly tests our faith, and many people will have spiritual ruptures at these times. Ultimately, if you can slowly heal, take yourself back, find your voice, express your needs and wants, and no longer live in the shadow of that relationship, there was some justice, not for them, but for you. I think that sadly, that may be all we can expect. And this is why focusing on your healing is so important, because it may be the only path forward to justice. Today I'm going to talk about some of the things that make healing a little bit difficult in narcissistic relationships. And specifically, I'm going to talk about how do you heal from a narcissistic relationship when there is no sort of justice in it. And I'll explain more what I mean in a minute. But if you're new to this channel, please join us, hit that subscribe button, and you will be part of a magnificent community. But let's talk about this. Let's start from the beginning. Let's face it, whenever there is narcissistic abuse in a film or a television show, at the end of the show, at the end of the film, more often than not, there is a sense of justice for the victim. Something happens. The perpetrator either dies or goes to jail or loses the new wife or the new husband or the new girlfriend or the new boyfriend, or they lose their money, or they lose their career, or their reputation, or they're publicly shamed in some manner, and everybody sees it, and the narcissist goes off into some kind of exile, right? So think about it. I want you to really think about it. In every recent film or TV show I have seen about one person who is really narcissistically abusive to another person, there is always some kind of justice that allows us as the viewer to almost feel a little bit more, resolved at the end of the program. For example, there'll be that courtroom scene, a big contentious divorce from a narcissist, and the judge actually gets it and sees the narcissist clearly and awards the non-narcissist full custody and the house, and there's cheering in the courtroom, and the narcissist is chastened by the judge, and I can tell you now that rarely, if ever, happens in real life. Obviously, if we were to think about it, the victim has been traumatized, and being traumatized is never just. But by and large, we see that the difficult person or perpetrator in these stories and films or whatever, they get what's due to them. And in fact, one thing let's take a step back. In fact, even in real life sagas, for example, Jeffrey Epstein, Harvey Weinstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, Bernie Madoff, Keith Raniere, all of these people who were really, really not nice people, very narcissistic, at least there was a visible penalty at the end of these real life stories. They ruined so many people's lives, but there was a penalty. Maybe not quite an eye for an eye, but close enough. In the comments, I'd love for you to point out those shows and movies where the narcissistic story kind of has a resolution, right? It'd be interesting to see what you come up with. But our brains need this. We are able to regulate better and be more resolute and calm when we perceive that there has been justice. And Hollywood and Hollywood storytellers know this. Again, drop your ideas in the comments of the shows you've seen like that. But here's the deal. In real life narcissistic abuse, the revenge, the punishment, the justice rarely happens. More often than not, the narcissist just moves on. In the case of divorces, they continue to mess around with the court system and get their way. They waste time, they waste money to fight over tiny details and get away with it. They continue to antagonize their ex-partners even long after the children are grown up, and certainly when the children are minor children, and they bleed down bank accounts with lawyers' fees and create a sense of menace in their current partners or their ex-partners' lives as the divorce proceeds. Or the narcissist may then walk off into the sunset and marry their new partner, often probably not an age-appropriate partner, but their new partner, and make a new family and a new life after trashing your life. In the case of the workplace, the narcissists often win large settlements and NDAs are signed, and they get to continue going on to the next job and the next set of co-workers and do their damage in the next place there as well, because the NDA hides their story from the public. In the case of families, the narcissistic parent will continue to triangulate the family system and get away with it. Or the toxic sibling who never stepped in, never attempted to help out maybe parents who were struggling or anything, still walks away with an inheritance or another support. That's typically how it goes, and you know it. You know it. You've all been through it. Healing when there is justice in the case of narcissistic abuse is hard enough because the damage was real. The trauma was real. Those things happened and they impact you. But the brain is able to sort of work stuff through a little bit easier if there is an acceptable resolution. Basically, a resolution that, for you at least, feels just. Now, what is just to one person may not be just to another, but in general, just knowing that someone who engaged in narcissistic abuse faced some real consequences absolutely helps people heal. And in fact, if any of you had stories of justice, again, drop them in the comments because it would be so good for us to hear that some people had just stories. But let's talk about back though to when there is no justice. How the heck are you supposed to heal when there's no justice? A lifetime could be wasted wanting to get revenge on the narcissist, a vindictive hope that it will go south for them. If you get too lost in that kind of thinking, then keep in mind that you are still basically in the relationship and giving the narcissist too much valuable psychological real estate. And you may be missing out on your own life by ruminating about wanting something bad to happen to them. Now listen, it is normal to want vindication and justice, but it's bad for your mental health to remain stuck there. You know, in another video I said this, I have often said that the gold standard of narcissistic healing is indifference. The point at which you just don't care. And you are glad that the person is just no longer in your life. You're like, I don't care. I just do not care what happens to them. Okay? The legacies of narcissistic abuse, simply put, suck. There's very few good legacies. There are a few, but not a lot. After a narcissistic relationship, you are less trusting, more skittish, more cynical, more hypervigilant. You walk around feeling like you're not enough. You second guess yourself, even after years out of the relationship. And you still gaslight yourself. You talk yourself out of stuff, and you still need reassurance. All of that remains for a long time, even a lifetime. Now that said, remember what Viktor Frankl said. What is to give light must endure burning. You did the hard miles. You got burned. And you have emerged a survivor. And let's face it, survivors are always the most interesting people at the dinner party. Now here's the ultimate issue. The narcissist still has to be them. They still have to walk around the world like that with their emptiness and their insecurity and their endless validation seeking and their need for admiration and their paranoid fears about the world and never feeling like anything that happens to them is enough. It's a joyless life. It sucks to be them. And perhaps them being stuck with their empty inner world, maybe that should be punishment enough, and that you don't need to participate in it anymore. So many people want to believe in a distorted version of karma, right? That good people will have good things happen to them and they ultimately win, and bad people ultimately lose. Listen, I was raised Hindu and I'm telling you that's not how karma works, okay? When it does, okay, when it does work out for you, it's all right to have a little schadenfreude and smile inwardly, but that's actually not karma, it's luck when the rotten things happen to the rotten person. Lots of narcissistic abusers are out there doing terrible damage to good people and walking out scot-free with no consequences. And on top of that, it really does seem like narcissists live longer than other people because they bring stress to other people's lives, but because everyone walks on eggshells around them and protects the narcissist from stress, the narcissists live a long time. Like I said, the injustices kind of never end when it comes to narcissistic relationships. Healing in the face of the injustice that most, and the injustice and the idea that most narcissistic abusers will never face anything that resembles justice. It's difficult to heal under those conditions, but it's not impossible. And a major shift for you is to frame it differently. Instead of seeing it as them never getting a consequence for their terrible actions, view it as you actually winning your freedom. Freedom from their invalidation, freedom from their devaluation, from their minimization, from their gaslighting, from their entitlement, from their dehumanization, and from their lack of empathy. That you can slowly step away from their silencing voices and their silencing souls, and also start working towards no longer personalizing the things that are their issues. It may look like they've just waltzed happily into the sunset, into their happy ending. It's important to remember that for those narcissists out there, there are actually no happy endings for them because nothing's ever enough for them. It's just pretty much their ending is just them holding out for their next new source of narcissistic supply. I'm convinced that we watch movies about narcissistic abusers who get their consequences because it's so satisfying, and it's often not how real life works. I'll give you an example. I remember watching Big Little Lies. Okay, if you haven't watched it, I'm going to spoil it. So you should watch it by now. It was a long time ago. And there were two really awful narcissistic abusers in the show, actually a mother and a son. In the show, they both face consequences in the end. One dies and one doesn't win their court case. It was so satisfying. I found myself cheering at the TV. But at the same time, I also watched it with a bit of sadness. Because I know that most survivors of narcissistic abuse don't get this just moment. And in fact, these moments are actually quite complicated for the survivors. So please recognize that the moment of justice is typically a Hollywood thing. Otherwise, there's no real easy way for them to end the story. And it's really not real life. We are all going to have to learn to heal even without that justice and write new narratives that allow us to let go. So that's actually what can. I'd love to see this in the comment section because obviously I don't watch much. So I'd love to hear from you, like that example of that story, you know, where there's narcissistic abuse and everything just ends up tied with a bow. But the real challenge I want you to do in this comment section, can any of you think of films or stories where there was narcissistic abuse, but there wasn't the nice ending? Like the narcissistic abuser kind of gets away with it. I want to hear what your thoughts are on that too. So this could be an interesting conversation for everyone to have, because those of you who've watched these movies, you know what it feels like. It's almost like a relief. You're like, oh, I'm so glad he got it, or I'm so glad that happened to her. But then we have to go back to our lives where we don't get to see that justice. Thanks again. Thanks again. Thanks again. Thanks again. Thanks again.